podium over here because it's just easier to lord it over people. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. And I teach the history of science, technology, and medicine at Kane. Everyone always says Kane for some reason. It's Kane, just like the governor. Same family. And I'm going to talk to you about the Jersey Devil. And it's especially interesting to speak down here in Smithville on the Jersey Devil because it's so close to Leeds Point, and it's the home of the Jersey Devil. At least that's what people think. And just in case anyone doesn't know the story, I will quickly go through it. In 1735, a woman named Mother Leeds gives birth to her 13th child. And as the child is breeching, it's a difficult birth, she screams out, "Oh, let this one be a devil." And rather than a normal baby coming out, a kind of horse-like thing with wings comes out, yelps at the astonished family, flies up the chimney, disappears off into the Pine Barrens, and spends the next several centuries accosting anyone unfortunate enough to encounter it. That's the story everyone knows. Unfortunately, everything you think you know about the Jersey Devil is wrong. It is not the result of a blaspheming mother. It is not the result of a monstrous birth gone horribly awry. There is no dragon-like beast that flies around the Pine Barrens. The origins of the Jersey Devil are not in any of those things. It's part of the very fabric of the origins of the nation, of America, of the state, what will become the state of New Jersey. It comes out of the religious and political infighting of the times. It comes out of an attempt to bring the scientific revolution to America. It is part of a family that are pioneers of publishing, of literature, of political activity, of religious activity. It involves a cross-dressing royal governor and a future founding father. And if we can get the first slide there. And so what I'm going to tell you is a much more interesting story, I think, that the actual origins of the Jersey Devil are much more interesting than than this. This is the popular image of the Jersey Devil. If you ask anybody who knows anything about this, they will give you basically this. But again, this is completely incorrect. And quite frankly, Smithville and Leeds Point have almost nothing to do with the story. It's a Burlington story, actually. So, many of you are from Burlington there. But so I want to bring you that story that I'm working on with a colleague of mine, Frank Esposito, Professor Frank Esposito at Kane, who, if you know anything about the writing on New Jersey history, you've heard that name. He's written a lot about the history of the state. And so I want to start with, next slide, please. Just to give us some sort of geographic orientation here, we are about here. The story is actually mostly taking place right around here. When this region is first settled by Europeans in the 1620s, it's originally called Novo Caesarea. And the first groups of Europeans that come to the region where we are here, what will become called the Pine Barrens, are actually mostly Swedes, but not in big numbers. By about the 1650s, 1660s, that's when the largest influx of European settlers, mostly English and mostly Quakers, starts showing up here. Famously, William Penn will come by and take a look. George Fox, who's considered the founder of Quakerism, they wind up in New York, and then they hear that there's all this land down here where there's hardly any people, so they come down and they kind of putter around the region for a while, and they decide that the place where Burlington is now is a great place would be a great place to start a settlement. That's in part because you can get relatively large ships up the Delaware. Part of the reason why Burlington and Philadelphia are located where they are is because that is about the extent that you can get up Delaware River with sort of a biggish sized sailing vessel. And so they got that far and they said, well, we can't get any further, we're going to live here. And so Burlington starts being formed about, say 1674, 1675 in there. So that gives us some orientation. Next slide, please. Now, you're looking at this slide right now and you're thinking one of two things. Wow, that is a really unattractive woman. This is Lord Cornbury. That's actually a man. In drag, yes. Although, hold on to that because in a minute we're going to find out it's not exactly what we think it is. In 1701, the British government under Queen Anne decides that what was East Jersey and West Jersey should be sort of screwed together and turned into an official royal colony, which it had not been up to that point. And so they do that. They unify East and West Jersey, and they make it a royal colony. And so they send over a British nobleman to be the first governor, the first royal governor. There had actually been governors before that. Prior to this, up till about 1701, from the earliest settlements up to about 1701, that's considered the period of the proprietorship. We basically had people who were close to the royal family in London, who for various reasons were gifted with parcels of land in the New World. And a couple of guys, Berkeley and Carteret, get handed what will become New Jersey. And the word New Jersey comes from the fact that Carteret had grown up on the island of Jersey in the British Channel, which is actually closer to France than it is to England, but we can go back to Henry V, and we don't have enough time for that. And so it gets called New Jersey. And Lord Cornbury becomes the first governor of New Jersey and New York simultaneously. He does not have a good reputation. He is considered one of the worst governors in New Jersey history. And if you know anything about New Jersey history, that's no mean feat. And one of the accusations made against him was that he was a cross-dresser. And this portrait, which hangs to this day in the New York Historical Society. Next time you're in Manhattan, go to the New York Historical Society. It's a huge life-size portrait, one of these giant oil paintings, and it still hangs in private plates. And it used to say, Portrait of Lord Cornbury, cross-dressing. Now they have a slightly adjusted version, because around 2001 or so, a really terrific historian named Patricia Bonomi did a major renovation of and reassessment of Cornbury's career, and discovered that he really wasn't that bad as far as governors go. Really wasn't that bad of a governor, and wasn't a cross-dresser. That the accusation of cross-dressing was, and this should sound very familiar, was an accusation made by sort of anti-government pundits who wanted to make him look bad. So they started spreading these rumors that he did this. And the painting, we now know, has no connection to Cornbury whatsoever. We really don't know who this is. Art historians who have studied it, they're pretty sure it is actually a woman. But that it has no connection to Lord Cornbury whatsoever. Now, the reason why I mention this at all is because when Cornbury, his actual name was Edward Hyde, and I have a colleague in the history department at Kane, Elizabeth Hyde, and I always kind of give her a little, about this. No connection to them, however. But the reason why I mention this at all is because when Cornbury becomes governor of New Jersey, he, as part of the paperwork he gets, so the official sanction that makes him governor, there's a list of his local councilors. And one of them is Daniel Leeds. And in the story of the Jersey Devil, other than the devil itself, there's always two people that get mentioned. Mother Leeds and Daniel Leeds as the parents of the Jersey Devil. The Mother Leeds never existed. She's a figment of the imagination. But Daniel Leeds actually did exist. Next slide, please. I got to fix this because one of the great things about being a historian is you're constantly digging for this information, and you're constantly changing your ideas because you get new information. He was not actually born in Leeds, England. He was born in Stansted, England, which is much closer to London. I just discovered a collection of papers about the Leeds family in England before they come over here, which no one had ever looked at before. But he does arrive in either 1677 or 78, and we're still not exactly sure. If you know anything about the founding of Burlington or the founding of Philadelphia, they always talk about these two ships, the Shield and the Kent, as the two first major-sized vessels traveled up the Delaware River carrying Quaker settlers. And they always say that, well, Leeds and his family came in on the Kent or the Shield. The problem is there are fairly extensive records of passengers on those two ships, and the Leeds name doesn't appear on any of them. We know he gets here, but at this point we're not really sure how. But he arrives in Burlington around 1677-78. He's only about 25 years old. He immediately marries a young girl here named Aunt Stacy, who dies right away. It wasn't good luck to be married to Daniel Leeds. He's got about 4 wives over the course of his life. They all die. Except for Dorothy Young, who produces a whole house full of kids by 1699 and then dies. His final wife is Jane Revel, and in some versions of the Jersey Devil story, Mother Leeds is named Jane. The problem is there are no extant records referring to any of his wives or any woman of this period as Mother Leeds. So that's probably a fabrication. But he produces a house full of kids. He wants to be a mover and shaker. He starts buying land. He initially starts out as a cooper, but then starts farming. And he gets very involved in local politics. He is a Quaker, and when the Quakers start showing up in the Burlington area, they don't have a meeting house. And so their first sort of official meeting areas, they cannibalize the ship, the Shield. And they make kind of a tent-like structure. But then they decide, well, we need a regular house, a regular building to meet in. And that building is still there in Burlington. And Daniel Leeds subscribes the not inconsiderable amount of £4 to the building of the first Quaker meeting house. He's deeply involved in local politics. He buys a house which he calls his plantation in what is sometimes called Jackson, is also sometimes called, the name just flew out of my head. Not Summit. Springfield, thank you. Alternately called Jackson and Springfield. Not the big city of Springfield that's up north, but a small, right outside of what is Burlington. He builds a house, and that's the house he lives in the whole time. He never really lives anyplace else but in the house in Jackson. He eventually, because he becomes the Surveyor General of West Jersey, and that sounds really impressive. He also serves in the Assembly. He also serves on the Supreme Court of New Jersey, and this sounds incredibly impressive, but at the time, basically, if you had some land, you could be on anything. He doesn't have any training as a surveyor, but he owns some land, so all right, you're the surveyor now. You got enough land? Okay, you're on the Supreme Court now. But I don't have any legal training. That's okay, you got land, that's enough. And he surveys a parcel of land out near, not far from here, near Great Egg Harbor, and calls it Leeds Point. And he hands that down to his son, his eldest son Japheth, who's also a very intense Quaker. But Daniel himself never actually lives in the Leeds Point house. It's his oldest son who lives there. His most important son is Titan, the youngest, and we'll come back to him. Next slide, please. Now, in 1687, Daniel Leeds publishes an almanac. Daniel Leeds is a really interesting character. He is taught not in the regular British education system because his family, as Quakers, are considered dissenters. And they're not allowed to go to either Oxford or Cambridge. It had to be an Anglican. But they begin to sort of set up their own educational system. And he is extremely well-read in matters of theology and astrology and science. And when he comes over, he has this idea that he wants to bring the scientific revolution to America. He wants to bring astronomy, mathematics, the works of Roger Bacon, and all those, he reads extensively of the members of the Royal Society. So he thinks what my contribution is going to be is I'm going to bring scientific revolution to America. And his first attempt at this is this almanac, which comes out in 1887. And this is the entire thing. It's a broadsheet. It's one page, printed on one side only, and it's kind of hard to see from where you are, but each one of these columns is a month, and it shows the sunrise and sunset, all those sort of things that are involved in almanacs. The first almanacs printed in America come out of Boston, out of Harvard, and there is very little printing that goes on in New Jersey. In fact, even while Leeds is alive, the first printing press isn't set up in New Jersey until the 1740s, so almost right before the Revolution. But luckily for Leeds, a few years after he arrives, William Bradford shows up. Bradford is a Quaker printer who comes from London. He is trained under William Sewell, who is a very famous Quaker printer, who's printing in basements because they're running away from government agents, you know, and printing on the run and all that kind of stuff. And he decides to come to America to set up a press. So he shows up, and he sets up his first press in Burlington, and he prints an almanac for somebody else first, one issue. And the Quakers don't like almanacs. They don't like the occult, they don't like astrology, and they think that almanacs are, you know, works of the devil, and they tell Bradford to knock it off. And so the first almanac printed in New Jersey by a guy named Atkins, that gets lost. And then Daniel Leeds comes along. And he meets with Bradford. They become fast friends. They share a lot of ideas in common. They become lifelong friends, in fact. And Bradford says, I'll publish your almanac again. I don't care what the Quaker fathers say. So this gets produced. And the Quaker fathers go a little cuckoo. They think this is very occult-driven, very astrological-driven, and they force Bradford to destroy all the copies of what is now referred to as the Leeds Almanac. And anybody who has copies, if you're a Quaker, the Quaker elders say, if you've got a copy of this, get rid of it. Because if you have a copy of this, if you read Leeds' Almanac, you're not really being a good Quaker. And so Daniel Leeds is sort of, hurt by this. And they make him, according to Quaker rules, he has to go to the meeting house and apologize in public. To the meeting house he helped build. He's got to stand up in front of his neighbors and say, I'm sorry I did this, I won't do it again. But he has no intention of not doing it again. This just makes him more determined. Next slide, please. This is a later version of a kind of almanac very similar to his. Part of the reason the Quakers didn't like this, this is a very common kind of illustration that you'll find in 16th, 17th, and 18th century almanacs. This is called the Zodiac Man. And medicine at the time was very linked in with astrology. In fact, we refer to it as medical astrology. And like today, for example, if you don't feel well, you go to the doctor. What does the doctor do? The doctor examines you physically. Maybe take some blood, do an EKG. But the astrological doctors didn't do any of that. When you went to a medical astrologer, the first thing they asked you was, what's your birthday? And they would then cast your horoscope and say, well, if you got a pain in your side, the side that's Sagittarius, that means tourmaline is the crystal associated with this. Here, wear this piece of crystal. That will make you better. And that was not some sort of fringe thing. That was basic medicine in the West for a long time. And so Lee includes a lot of that in his almanacs. Next slide, please. Now, after being rebuffed because of the almanac, Leeds isn't really sure what to do, but he's got all these ideas in his head. He's a real writer. He's just got to get ideas out. He can't, not be a writer. And he decides, well, maybe I didn't make myself clear enough with the almanac. Maybe what I need to do is do a more detailed version of my cosmology, and that way people will understand. And so he writes a book in 1688, The Temple of Wisdom for the Little World. This is the very first book published in New Jersey, the very first book published south of Boston in American history. Very unusual. Again, it's printed by William Bradford, and it's a very interesting book because what Leeds is trying to do is bring a kind of theological science to the New World. A Christian theology, but which is grounded in the rationalist science of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And he thinks, if I can just do this, he's a very religious guy. In his youth, back in England, he has a number of ecstatic experiences. One in which he says, I saw Jesus. Jesus talked to me. It was so powerful, I fainted in the field. And he thinks if he can just somehow create a new way of thinking that combines both religion and science, it will open everyone up to this kind of deeper understanding of the divine, deeper understanding of how the universe works. He's heavily influenced by a German pietist called Jakob Burma, whose works are very popular at this time, and Francis Bacon as well. And he puts all of this into the Temple of Wisdom, to the point of copying out large tracts, big chunks of Burma's work, of Francis Bacon's work, along with the work of some astrologers. And he thinks, okay, now I've got it. People will understand, people will accept this, and I'll accomplish what I want to accomplish. And so this thing hits the shelves, as it were, and right down the toilet. They react, the Quaker elders react to the Temple of Wisdom in much the same way they react to the almanac. They tell people, don't buy this. If you have it, destroy it. They get copies they round up copies from Bradford and destroy them. It's such an extensive effort to eliminate this guy's work that we only have one existing copy of the Temple of Wisdom. And it's a copy which is in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And if it wasn't for that one copy, we would have no idea what this book was even about. That's how extensive the censorship. Leeds is on the receiving end of the first major censorship campaign, political censorship campaign in America. And this just devastates him because he joined the Quakers, their formal name is the Society of Friends, because he felt these people loved him and embraced him and felt the same way he did. And he feels utterly betrayed, and he decides, well, I'm going to give up on my attempt to bring the scientific revolution to America, and I'm going to get them damn Quakers no matter what. And he wants to be, his dream is to be this kind of ethereal sage, wandering through the Pine Barrens, expounding on philosophy and science and theology, but the Quakers sort of killed that. So he decides to reconfigure himself as a political attack dog. And he starts writing more books, all of them anti-Quaker books, where he goes on at length about the Quakers are bad for this reason, and they're adulterers, and they screw over their tradesmen, and they don't pay their bills, and they do this terrible thing and that, and they don't really love Jesus, and they hate the government, and all these sort of things. And it begins a pamphlet war, because Quaker apologists start producing material back. And there is this period of about 20 years in New Jersey history, from about the early mid-1690s through about 1710, 1715, this kind of tennis match where Leeds publishes a pamphlet saying, well, George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, he didn't even write his own books. He paid others to do it for him because he wasn't smart enough. And then some Quaker apologists would write a pamphlet in return. And then he would write a pamphlet in return to the anti-Leeds pamphlet. So you have these pamphlets flying back and forth. Basically, you're stupid. No, you're stupid. No, you're stupid. No, you're, just endlessly on and on. This even reaches back to England. In fact, I'm going to be spending some time in Oxford in July at the Bodleian Library there because they have some of the few remaining copies of Leeds' work. because they were shipped over to England and they kind of saved them. And so in 1698, the Quakers are so upset with him. In their official records, they refer to him as evil. And one of the great Quaker apologists, Pusey, writes a book in 1700 in which he calls Leeds Satan's harbinger. Next slide, please. Now, I found this just recently. It's probably hard to see. Increase Mather was the sort of patriarch of Cotton Mather's father up there in Boston. And I've just found this document recently in the Mather collection at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester outside Boston. And I'm not sure yet. I don't think it's actually from Increase Mather. I think somehow it wound up in his papers. But someone had read the Temple of Wisdom, and let's see, Yaka Burma right here works, called Your Temple of Wisdom. So somebody's writing, this is a letter to Daniel Leeds, saying, oh, I read your book, I like it. I kind of like it. And then goes on about how, oh, I think it works very similar to the Jewish Kabbalah, and this wonderful 17th century handwriting. Very neat, and as you can see, the paper itself is a little damaged from water. But this is the sort of thing that historians like me live for. You wake up, where can I find them? Because we're always looking for the documents. Where are the documents? Where are the letters? Where are the diaries? So his book is being read around, and not just by Quakers. Next slide, please. By 1714, Daniel's pretty much had enough. He's exhausted from the fight. And he decides to retire, and he turns over writing the almanac to his youngest son, Titan. Of all the things the Jersey Devil story includes, there is a strong sort of father-son story. Because Daniel has a number of children, but Titan, the youngest, seems to be his pride and joy. Titan is the one who wants to carry on the whole scientific revolution thing, and so Titan winds up taking control of the almanac. And he'll print this for some years. Next slide, please. And this is just a close-up. This is the Leeds family crest right here. And there's this creature on the crest. Some people claim it's an eagle. I think it's a wyvern, which is kind of a dragon-like thing. And this is a very rough woodcut version, so they could print it. But it kind of looks like, it's got the kind of horsey head and the wings. So there's a little hint of what will become the Jersey Devil in that. Next slide. Now, Ben Franklin. When Franklin arrives in Philadelphia, he wants to make a name for himself as a printer. And almanacs are very popular. They make money. They're cheap to produce. They're cheap to sell, so people buy them. And the almanac in the Philadelphia, West Jersey area is, of course, the Leeds Almanac. And so that's Franklin's competition. So when Franklin decides to create Poor Richard's Almanac, he decides that a good way to start this off is kind of with a bang, kind of with a scandal. So in the very first edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, he says, Poor Richard says, I have consulted the stars. I've done the alchemical computations, and I've discovered that this year, this is 1733, this year, Titan Leeds will die. And Titan Leeds sees this and says, well, this is crazy, I'm not dead. This Franklin guy is a fool and a liar. And Franklin never misses a beat. He just keeps a straight face. And he says, these accusations that are being made under the name of Titan Leeds was my friend. He would never say horrible things about me like this. This must be the ghost of Titan Leeds. And Titan Leeds he's just fuming. Because every time he tried to counter this, Franklin well, that's not, Titan Leeds is my friend, he would never say anything bad about me. But I've seen Titan Leeds walking around, if you've seen Titan Leeds walking around, that must mean that the ghost of Titan Leeds has come back to life as a sorcerer. And so now you have Titan Leeds being accused of being a ghost and being somehow involved in the occult. Titan Leeds actually doesn't die until 1738. But the ruse works. The Leeds Almanac goes into decline, and Poor Richard's Almanac becomes the almanac. In fact, when we think of almanacs in America, nobody thinks of the Leeds family anymore. They think of Poor Richard. They think that this is the first almanac ever, when in fact it wasn't. And so Franklin is very effective in his, what we would today call a smear campaign, to make his rival look bad, to get people to stop reading his rival's publication and read his. Next slide, please. Now, in the 18th century, an easy way to make your rival in whatever way look bad was accuse them of being a devil. We go through all sorts of variations on this theme throughout American history. At one period, if you wanted to ruin somebody's career, you call them a witch. Now it's you call them a socialist. Now you say he's a secret Muslim. But anything, the idea, the terms change, the idea has remained the same. And in this period, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, if you wanted to insult someone to make them look bad politically, you said they were a devil of some kind. And these are drawings that come out from this period. And you can see, look how familiar that looks. And these are drawings that have nothing to do with New Jersey, nothing to do with the Leeds family. Next slide, please. This is my personal favorite. This is actually from a little before Leeds, from 1641. This is a pamphlet which was published in England when a couple of preachers get into a pamphlet war. Pamphlet wars were very popular. And look at this guy here. Actually, it's supposed to be a female. Looks very much like the descriptions of the Jersey Devil. And if you kind of look close, the character is doing exactly what you think it's doing to the guy lying down. And I won't go any further. But I show you this for two reasons, because it's just so cool. In a creepy kind of way. But to show you that this image of this kind of caricature is already being used prior to the Leeds family and will be used afterwards. In fact, if I covered all this over and I just told you, well, this is an image of the Jersey Devil, you probably would not. You would accept it immediately and you wouldn't even question. Next, please. Now, by the time of the Revolution, because the Leeds family sides with the government, they side with Lord Cornbury, they side with the Anglican Church, because Leeds will eventually leave the Quakers and convert to Anglicanism, and he joins the Anglican Church, which was considered the mainstream at the time, the religion of the empire, the religion of the power structure. The term Leeds Devil becomes a kind of political term to sort of vaguely suggest un-American, not really for the people over here, siding with the power structure, siding with the empire, which is interesting because Daniel Leeds' grandson, I'm going to say grandson rather than great-grandson, Jeremiah, fights with some distinction in the Revolution. He's at the Battle of Red Bank. He's at the battle where American forces try to keep the British out of Philadelphia. He is stationed for a while out at Leeds Point and witnesses a British ship running aground and then being burned by its crew so it won't be captured. He serves with such, he starts as a private, he winds up a lieutenant, and serves with such distinction that years later he gets awarded a pension for his service in the Revolution. He's also sort of well known if you know anything about Atlantic City history. He buys land on Abascon Island and puts up the first house, the first permanent structure, and goes down in history as the first citizen of Atlantic City. And I think it's his son, Chalky Leeds, who becomes the first mayor of Atlantic City. And I always wondered, do the Leeds still own that land? Because if they did, they must not. Because if they did, they'd be fabulously wealthy. Because the site of the Jeremiah Leeds house is, I think, where Baltic Avenue is now.
Leeds Avenue and Bowling.
I believe,
Right.
I believe he's part of Northfield, isn't he?
Yeah, I know there's a plaque out there that says Jeremiah Leeds, first citizen.
Yeah.
By the period after the Revolution, by the late 18th into the early 19th century, the period that we call the early Republic, the Leeds Devil legend has basically disappeared. No one really knows it anymore. Very few people believe in it. You still find some people in the Pine Barrens who kind of are sort of aware of it. But by the period of the Civil War, it's essentially gone extinct. Nobody really thinks about it anymore. And that brings us up to the late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, in this story, there are actually two devils involved in this story. There's the Leeds Devil and the Jersey Devil. And they're not necessarily the same, I'm not even sure what entity, let's just say entity for the time being. They're closely related, but they're not the same. And in the early 20th century, around Leeds Point, around Mount Holly, and some other places, people claim, it's in the wintertime, 1905-ish, they claim they find crazy footprints in the snow of an animal they've never seen before. And people are kind of perplexed. And somewhere in there, someone says, oh, you know, I remember my grandparents telling me about this Leeds Devil thing. Maybe it's the Leeds Devil. And that will sort of begin the Jersey Devil part of the story. Because up until this point, we're just talking about the Leeds Devil. Jersey Devil doesn't exist yet. And I have a photograph of the birthplace of the Leeds Devil. Now, when I show you this, I don't want you to go crazy. Because in the wrong hands, this information could be explosive. It could rock the very foundations of New Jersey society. But I have a photograph, I'm going to show it to you, of the birthplace of the Jersey Devil. And there it is. Bit of a letdown. This is in Philadelphia. This is the 9th and Arch Street Dime Museum. Dime museums were very popular in the 19th century. They were kind of like stationary sideshows. And they called them museums. But don't think in the term, you understand the word museum today, don't think in those terms. The term museum was thrown at these things to give it a kind of intellectual legitimacy. But they were basically freak shows. Stationary freak shows that didn't move around like a circus does. And they would have acrobats, and they would have, you know, people swallowing swords, and they would have two-headed cows and that kind of thing. And they were real popular. They were called dime museums because it only cost a dime to get in. And the 9th and Arch Street Museum was very popular, and it was, in a way, it was kind of pioneering because the guy who owned it at the time, a guy named Charles Bradenberg, was sort of a pioneer. He's one of the first people in the world to show movies and charge people to see them. Motion pictures were only just coming out then. And he was one of the first guys saying, people will probably pay to see these things. So he started showing these very short, silent films. And you come in your little room, and it lasts a minute, and you pay a dime, and you get to see this. But by about, 1905, 1909, the museum is falling on hard times. Not as many people are coming to see it. And that's when these footprint stories start showing up. And people start mentioning the Leeds Devil. And Bradenberg and his public relations man named Jeffries see these and they think, jackpot. They decide they are going to start showing people the real Leeds Devil. So they found a guy up in Albany who was a kind of animal trainer, animal renter, who would rent exotic animals, and he had a kangaroo. So they rent the kangaroo. They bring the kangaroo down to the museum. They paint it green. They attach little fake wings to it. They stick it in a cage, and we have captured the Leeds Devil. Come and see the Leeds Devil. Jeffries thought Leeds Devil didn't quite sing. So he starts using the term Jersey Devil because he thinks this sounds better, this catches people's imagination better. So they start saying, we've captured the Jersey Devil. And so people would pay to come in, and they would have it in a cage in a darkened room on a little stage, and behind a curtain, they had this little kid standing there with a stick with a nail in it. And whenever a group of rubes would come in, the kid would poke the kangaroo. The kangaroo obviously would start jumping around yelping, and that would scare the people, and then they would leave, and then you bring another group in, and they'd stab the poor kangaroo. And the crowd started coming, and they made a fortune off of this. After a few weeks, however, people started saying, you know, that looks like a kangaroo with cardboard wings on it. I'm not a specialist or anything, but I don't think that looks real. And so the thing sort of falls apart, and the guys go, oh, of course it's fake, we're gonna... But the damage, as it were, is done. And now people have this idea of the Jersey Devil. And now people start seeing it everywhere. They eventually sent the poor kangaroo back to Albany. I don't know what happened to it after that yet, but... and so what has happened here is a transformation has taken place. Not only has the Leeds Devil been transformed into the Jersey Devil, but the Leeds family has been transformed. The reality is the Leedses were erudite, well-educated, sort of progressive forward thinkers, people who were theological and scientific, and who wanted to bring literature and culture and science to the new world. But by the 20th century, when the Jersey Devil story starts spreading around, this sort of incredible family has now been kind of retooled into these sort of country bumpkins, living in the Pine Barrens, Pineys, who kind of live in rough hovels and do witchcraft and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so not only has the creature itself been transformed, but the people have been transformed. And so that today, the actual original Leeds family has been totally divorced from the story and forgotten completely. And all we see is this, this monster story. Do I have any slides left there? No, okay. I'll finish up with this. One of the reasons why I love being a historian, I love this job. I get up in the morning, I can't wait to go to my office and see my students, do research. I've been around the world doing research. I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the Atlantic County Historical Society and the Burlington County Historical Society this summer, over at the Bodleian, with the New Jersey material they have over there. But one of the things that happens to historians is that you often start off a project thinking you're looking for this. And by the time it's done, you realize, actually I was looking for that over here. And when my colleague Frank Esposito and I started this project last year, we thought we were doing a monster hunt. We thought we were going to find at the end of the story a monster. But what we wound up finding was real people who had been lost and forgotten. And we hope that through our effort we help them find their way home. Thank you very much.
Questions and answers?
Sir?
Yeah, 50 years ago, they had a drink here on, they still have it called the Jersey Devil
Uh-huh.
cocktail.
Sure.
Remember juice in it.
Right, of course.
Everybody invented
Right.
it. When he left here, he opened the Pitney Tavern, which is on Pitney Bridge.
All
Yes.
the leads I knew were pumpkins.
I'm sorry?
All the leads I knew were pumpkins.
All right. Yeah, there's still lots of Leedses around. The family, the family line lineage is still fairly strong in the region.
Watch yourself, Ben.
I knew you.
Yes, that's how I'm in the Sons of the Revolution.
Right.
Jeremiah.
Right.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, I would just like to say that I'm descended from the Burlington Quakers. They came on the shield
Right.
of the Kent,
Mm-hmm.
and at the American Revolution, at the outset of the American Revolution, actually, exclusive of it, they became small town in South Jersey had a Methodist church.
Well, what happens is around the time that Leeds starts having his sort of set to with the Quakers, what historians call the Keithian Schism breaks out. And this was a kind of battle within Quakerism. You had the American Quakers who had been here for a little while, who sort of took this more emotional view of their religion, this what they called inner light. Part of we call them Quakers now, and they even called them Quakers back then, but the actual name is the Society of Friends. And they believed that God was in you and caused you to sort of shake and kind of glow with an inner divine light, and that shaking is where the term Quaker comes from. They quake with the divine life of the Lord. And then, of course, their detractors started calling them Quakers as an insult. And Shakers, the same thing. And as often happens when people are called something as an insult, they will adopt the insult and use it themselves as a way to take the sting out of the insult. So even they start calling themselves Quakers. But there was this sort of second generation that comes over from England, exemplified by this guy, George Keith, who saw Quakerism in a much more intellectual, text-driven sort of approach. And the sort of intellectual versus emotional battle takes place. And Keith, who is a Quaker, splits from them and becomes an Anglican and takes a lot of followers with him, including William Bradford and Daniel Leeds and a lot of others. And so the power structure that the Quakers had built up begins to crumble. And so they lose a lot of the political power that they had had. Yes?
I don't know what I expected to hear tonight, but what you've come out with makes more sense than anything I've ever heard before.
Thank you. Sir?
Do we not have some evidence that Daniel did in fact live, at least for a period, in Leeds Point area?
You know, I don't think so, because everything that I've seen is that when he builds the house in Jackson, that's basically where he stays, as far as living is concerned, for the rest of his life. I think part of the reason that Titan was his favorite is because Titan lives there and will live his whole life there. There is documentary evidence to show that after Daniel dies, Titan may have, and I'm not sure why, but he decides to sell the Jackson plantation. And when Daniel surveys the land at Great Egg Harbor, or near Great Egg Harbor, that will become Leeds Point, he's doing that to give the land to his oldest son, Japheth. And Japheth builds the house there, and a lot of the family. I'm sure Daniel, he's the father, I'm sure he visited. Right. But I haven't seen anything.
Couple points. There's a couple deeds that exist where they mention that he makes his home in one of them in particular, Egg Harbor Township.
Okay.
Now back then, Egg Harbor Township comprised this whole area.
Sure.
And another one mentions Little Egg Harbor as residence. And also in his almanac for, I think it was 1704, he apologizes for errors. Right.
Yes, he's doing that constantly, actually, because Bradford, excuse me. Bradford has had enough with the Quakers, and he leaves his printing press in Philadelphia, but he goes to New York and sets up a new printing press there and leaves an apprentice to run the operation in Philadelphia. And Daniel, because he's good friends with William Bradford, he wants Bradford to do all the printing, but he would have to send the manuscripts to New York. And that was not easily done in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And so he would often bring his manuscripts to the Philadelphia office, as it were. And I guess Bradford's apprentice wasn't as meticulous as Bradford himself and was constantly getting stuff wrong in the printed version. And so one version would come out, and then the next version he would have to include like this caveat, well, I apologize for last year's almanac because, It should have said. So he's doing that all the time, and a lot of his detractors used that, against him, saying, "Well, why should we believe you? You spelled the wrong. You get your calculations incorrect."
Yeah, the way I had understood it was he was so far removed, possibly being out here. I think he makes mention to Old New York Road,
Right.
which is right there. Yeah.
Right. We're on Old New York. Right.
As being the reason why he's unable to access his editors and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I have no problem with that. I'm sure he lived.
And maybe avoid persecution, maybe even.
That may be. One of the things that's really interesting is by about 1700, 1701, when he's on the Supreme Court. He's on the Supreme Court with a number of guys who are writing pamphlets against him.
Samuel Jackson.
John Pusey and a couple of others. And so these guys would have been in print calling, you schmuck, no, you, and then they had to sit there together on the Supreme Court looking at each other when they knew they had written, to our 21st century ears, it's not really, when you call something a blackguard, no one really gets, but in 1701 to call someone a blackguard was a pretty serious accusation. That was sort of like using really foul language today, and they would have to sit there and stare at each other on that. So I would love to find some, court records, court transcripts where the recorder was writing down when these two guys were, yammering at each other about whatever. I haven't yet, but.
Just one other interesting point you mentioned, Jeremiah leads, but Daniel's son Japheth, who made the homestead here.
Right.
Interesting. He was baptized an Episcopalian when he was 21, but that same year he re-entered the Friends.
Right.
And married his wife Deborah, and oftentimes I see them receiving the credit for being the family of the birth of the Jersey
Yeah,
Devil.
well, most aficionados of the Jersey Devils, there are people all the time going out to the Leeds Point area, crashing around the bushes looking for the devil. They think they're going to find monsters.
I know, I live there, I see it all the time.
What I find, one of the really interesting things I find about the family is that the father, Daniel, he's in this war. This is a religious, this is a theological, political war. A bare knuckle, no holds barred battle. But his oldest son and several of his children remain Quakers. And the Leeds Point house is used for years as a Quaker meeting house. So, one half of the family is fighting with them and the other half of them are...
That was 1726 when they start... It probably was before that, but when they say the first Quaker meetings in Atlantic County were held at his house in 1726.
Right.
But you got 1735 as being like, the birth of the Jersey Devil.
Right, well, the usually accepted date for something that doesn't exist of the birth of the Jersey Devil is 1735. I work from a position that they confused the death of Titan, which is 1738, as the birth of the Jersey Devil. Because again, the family gets associated with devils and monsters and all these sort of nasty things, and so that therein lies the origins of this. To be completely honest, there is a huge gap in the story, which I have yet, neither Frank Esposito or myself have yet to be able to find any sort of printed material or manuscript material, letters, diaries, anything like that, that mentions the Leeds Devil prior to 1849. The oldest sort of popular periodical reference to this is from an article done in 1849 by a guy named Mayer, who's writing in Harper's Weekly, and writes a magazine article about the Pineys. And if you read this, it's really insulting. I mean, it's incredibly condescending. he refers to the Pineys as brutish and the sort of hive of just sort of disgusting people. Every kind of stereotype of the sort of backwoods family appears in this article. And he claims in the article that he runs into a woman named Sarah Butler in his travels. He's writing about the lives of these people. And he runs into this sort of older woman named Sarah Butler who lives in a tent in the Pine Barrens. And she's sort of ragged and filthy, and the teeth, going in different directions, and they're talking. And at one point, he's interviewing her out in the woods, and I guess the weather starts to turn bad. And he says, "Oh, we better head back to town because it looks like it's going to be a storm." And sort of offhandedly, she says, "Yeah, well, it looks like it'll be a storm, a bad storm, like the night I seen the Leeds devil." And so of course the guy's like, "What?" And she lives with her nephew, who is, from this description, is even more revolting than she is. He kind of, her nephew. He sort of stops her, shushes her, and then they kind of run off and disappear into the woods. And Mayer asks his sort of chaperone, "Well, what was that all about?" "Well, there's these weird people live out here, and you really can't take what they say at face value. They make up these stories, and there's this old story about the Leeds devil." And a lot of the later articles, so late 19th, early 20th century articles, and some of the canon works of Jersey Devil studies, particularly this guy, Henry Carlton Beck, basically just copy this article. And so there's this major gap in between the end of the Revolution and sort of the time of the Civil War, where there's almost nothing printed anywhere, not almost nothing, but nothing printed anywhere that makes reference to any of this. So there's this gap we kind of need to get over somehow, which we have yet to be able to do. Yeah?
Yeah, all of us who live in this area had to live down the Calicax.
Right.
I also wanted to ask you, have you ever heard of the story of Winter and a sandhill crane?
No.
That, like, in the city, I believe it was Camden. Sandhill cranes used to be common here, but as it became populated, the Indians left and all this stuff like that, it became very rare. And they stand as tall as a person.
Sure.
And have like big long legs and a big beak and all this stuff like that. And it was freezing out, and this thing was clacking around the city, and it had people scared to death.
Sure. Well,
excuse me, we're
yeah.
going to have to wrap up now.
Yeah.
Okay. I thank you for inviting me. Thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it, and it was my pleasure to be here.
Well, all I can say is, every time that I really got impish as a child, my grandmother, who was not from the Leeds side of the family, she was from the Italian side of the family, would tell me that I was acting like my ancestors. So I guess if she were still here, she'd have to swallow her story and come up with a new